The United Nations Security Council approved sanctions on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. But will they work? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Earlier this month, the UN Security Council voted to apply new sanctions against the DPRK over that country's recent nuclear tests and satellite launch. China and the United States were two of the 15-member council states to unanimously approve the measures. Coming up shortly, I will discuss the implications of this with a panel of experts, but we begin with CCTV correspondent Han Peng, who joins us from Beijing. And Han, why did China vote for these new UN sanctions on the DPRK?
Well, Anand, the resolution was indeed raised by Washington, but it had already been largely agreed upon by China before it was presented to the United Nations. Later in February, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi met with his U.S. counterpart John Kerry in Washington, and both sides announced that important progress had been made on the draft resolution on the DPRK's nuclear issue. During their meeting, China and the U.S. agreed not to accept the DPRK's nuclear missile program and not to recognize the DPRK as a nuclear weapon state. Wang Yi said the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is the only way to achieve peace, so China's opposition to the DPRK's nuclear program is its most important reason to vote for the sanction. Anand?
Okay, so let's look at the Chinese view on this. What does China hope to achieve with these sanctions?
Well, China's goal is to pressure the DPRK back to the negotiating table of the six-party talks. The talks have been halted since the DPRK pulled out in 2009. According to Foreign Minister Wang Yi, the new round of sanctions cannot provide a fundamental solution to the DPRK's nuclear issue unless the relevant parties would return to the track of dialogue and negotiation. And more notably, in his latest remarks on China's two sessions, Wang Yi said for the first time that China can be flexible on the forms of the talks. He said if it is difficult to gather all six parties, China is open to options of including, for example, 3 parties, 4 parties, or 5 parties. That's what Wang Yi said. The remarks came as he expressed concerns over the aggravating tensions in the peninsula and vows that China will not turn a blind eye to the instability in the region. So in short, no war, no instability, and no nuclear weapons is what China hopes to achieve.
All right, thanks, Peng. That's CCTV's Han Peng reporting from Beijing. Joining us now from Beijing is Yang Xie. He is a senior fellow at the China Institute of International Studies, and he's played an important role in the six-party talks on the DPRK nuclear issue, which are now stalled. Also joining us from Denver here in the United States is Christopher Hill. The Korea diplomat is a former U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Korea, and he led the U.S. delegation to the six-party talks. With me here in Washington is Yonho Kim. He is a senior researcher with the U.S. Korea Institute at Johns Hopkins University. Also with us is Amitav Acharya. He is professor of international relations at American University here in Washington. Welcome to all of you to the show. Before we start with the panel, let's get some reaction from China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi. He was speaking recently about the nuclear issue and the DPRK. Let's watch.
If the country seeks development and security, we're prepared to help and provide support. But at the same time, we have an unwavering commitment to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, and we will not accommodate the DPRK's pursuit of nuclear and missile programs.
Yang Xie, let me start with you. Why does China feel so strongly about the nuclear issue right now and the DPRK, and will these sanctions work?
Well, it seems to many audience and observers say China's position on DPRK's nuclear issue is getting tougher than before. On the surface, because North Korea has to go further and too far towards the nuclearization, so China's position is getting tougher and tougher along with their more and more progresses toward the nuclearization. But in nature, the nuclear issue, the deepened differences on the nuclear issue between Beijing and Pyongyang is fast growing. That China publicly, during the past, quietly, but publicly more and more expressed the opposition. But in fact, during the past, in most cases, we express our opposition behind the scene. So that's changed the format, reflect China want to increase the pressures on North Korea on their nuclearization ambition.
Ambassador Hill, the United Nations Security Council has tried before to curtail the DPRK's nuclear weapons program. Is there any reason to believe that sanctions are going to work this time? What is the U.S. perspective on this?
Well, certainly, I think the sanctions are very necessary. Whether they work is unclear at this point. But I think what is very important is that clearly China and the U.S. are working much better together, and perhaps even doing more behind the scenes, which I think is critical if this problem is to be solved. China cannot solve it. The United States cannot solve it. But maybe together, along with other Security Council members and six-party participants, maybe they can solve it. But I think the comments by the foreign minister were very revealing about, I think, a very clear and tough Chinese position, which is they're prepared to help North Korea with development and other issues, but they are not prepared ever to accept North Korea's nuclear ambitions. And frankly, I couldn't have said it better myself. I think it's very much what the U.S. position has been ever since the six-party joint statement in September 2005.
Yonho, so we have a resolution that's been passed, new sanctions in place right now, tougher sanctions. How will this impact the relationship between the DPRK and the Republic of Korea, South Korea?
Well, obviously, it has been a very negative impact on the relationship. President Park Geun-hye, the South Korean president, has already decided to shut down the Kaesong industrial complex that it had, the South Korean side had jointly run with Pyongyang in the northern city, the border city of Kaesong. And also, right after the UN sanctions adopted, South Korea also followed up on that by unveiling a set of unilateral measures against North Korea. That includes blacklisting North Korean individuals and their entities. And one of the individuals designated by the South Korean government is the person who is in charge of inter-Korean dialogue. So I think that symbolizes a lot and sending strong message to North Korea.
Amitav, there's been strong opposition from the international community to the DPRK's nuclear program, but the DPRK has remained very defiant about this. 2 months ago, they carried out a fourth nuclear test. Will these sanctions make a difference, and how important is it that the United States and China are now publicly on the same page?
Well, that's the key. The fact that United States and China are coming to the same page, as Ambassador Hill pointed out, that is really a game changer. And this has implications beyond even North Korea, because it may come as a surprise to some people, but there are many, at least some analysts, and who have already said that the US and China have a common interest in preventing a nuclear weapon, North Korea as a nuclear weapon power or state. Mm-hmm. And that's been evident for some time. And some of that was going on privately. Chinese pressure on North Korea might have been privately, as a Chinese colleague pointed out. But this is in the nature of things. So the US and China have a common interest on certain aspects of managing regional security. In other aspects, like for South China Sea, they don't. But this is a very significant development, and I can only hope, as somebody who studies regional security in Asia more generally, that the US and China will find common ground in other areas of other regional issues, like the South China Sea, for example. Mm-hmm. So this is a very important development, and I cannot overemphasize the tone of the foreign minister, Chinese foreign minister Yang Yi's, his tone was so forthright, so forceful, that just watching it tells you that this is a different thing. There's a different level of cooperation, or understanding at least, between the US and China in managing what is definitely one of the most significant challenges to the security of the region.
Yongxue, as Amitav points out, it is in the common interest of both China and the United States to make sure that the DPRK does not have a nuclear program. But the China Daily newspaper made the point that the manner in which China wants to see these sanctions applied and the manner in which the US wants to see it applied are very different. What differences do you see between the way these two countries want these sanctions applied?
Well, basically, I don't think there's some substantive different positions on sanction measures, because both China and the US now really want to increase huge pressures on DPRK to slow down, if not stop, their nuclear progresses, and also make pressures on their politics to force them to reconsider their nuclear policies. But I think a sort of strategic difference between Beijing and Washington, D.C. remain there. Say, China seeks for policy change of the DPRK, say nuclear policy change. And many Chinese believe U.S. seek for regime change. So no matter it's a regime change or policy change, but China does have concerns about the humanitarian problems. So whenever we talk about and think about sanction measures, China has to be cautious to select all necessary measures, enough measures, but not trigger some humanitarian problems in the North Korean population. That position reflected the Chinese delegation, Chinese permanent mission to UN's discussion at UNSC. I think basically we have a common ground, but we have different concerns, and also the policy goals, say policy change or regime change. That's the indirect differences on the sanction measures.
Those are important differences that you point out there. Ambassador Hill, do you agree that these differences exist, that China wants policy change, the United States is looking for regime change?
Well, in many respects, it's a distinction without a difference. Look, if Kim Jong-un woke up tomorrow as a normal person who would be respectful of others' opinions and start acting like a mature individual, we would not be having this conversation. But clearly, this is someone whose bluster and whose capacity to threaten others and his singular attention and focus on nuclear weapons is really not the kind of policy outlook that anyone, whether the U.S. or the Chinese, can really work with. So I think the real issue is, of course, change of the behavior of this regime, fundamental change of the behavior of this regime, rather than the issue of, how does one get a new regime. I think the problem is that there is zero sign that Kim Jong-un has any interest in changing what, frankly speaking, has been very outrageous behavior. It's not just the missile test, the nuclear test, the repeated executions. I would even put them in the category of assassinations of senior people there, but it's also his rather blasé efforts to threaten other countries with nuclear weapons attacks because he's upset about a long-standing training and exercise drill that happens in the spring in South Korea every year. So far we see no sign of this person as being someone that we can reason with.
Right. I want to get to those exercises in a moment, but Ambassador Hill, I want to stay with you for one other point, and that is China has been stressing the need for diplomacy in trying to resolve this issue. Let's take a listen again to the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Let's watch.
One should see very clearly that only denuclearization can bring peace, only dialogue can provide a way out, and only cooperation can bring win-win outcomes.
So, Ambassador Hill, you've been at the center of these talks. How important is diplomacy in resolving this, and could this in some way pave the way to a resumption of the six-party talks?
I don't think any person would deny that diplomacy is the kind of approach that one would like to see. But unfortunately, it doesn't work all the time. And I think with respect to the North Koreans, I mean, we put a lot on the table for them in the six-party process. We would put things on the table because they said they wanted those things. And then once we agreed to do them, they would say they don't really want them. So I think the real impediment impediment to diplomacy is not coming from the U.S. side or other participants in the six-party process. It's clear the North Koreans don't want to have any talks unless the other side, that is the United States and other countries, accepts their view that they are a nuclear weapons state. So when they are prepared to deal in diplomacy on the basis of things they've already agreed to, that is denuclearization, then there's a way forward with diplomacy. But so far, they've shown no interest in any kind of diplomacy. They just want to sit and talk as a nuclear weapons state, and that's a position that I don't think China, nor the U.S., nor anyone is prepared to accept right now.
Okay, let me get the view from Yang Xie very quickly on the Chinese position. Is China fully invested in the six-party nuclear talks?
Well, let me put it this way. We have been a dilemma in the six-party talks. No progresses, almost failed, and diplomacy looks unworkable. So what is the reason, in my view? Let me introduce American terms, carrots and sticks, to describe the picture. Now we have neither big enough stakes and big enough carrots. So only when we have a big enough carrots and stakes, then the diplomacy can work. So now that we have the 2270 resolution by UNSC, I think the stake is bigger than before. And meanwhile, we need to build up a list to indicate the bright future for North Korea if North Korea really denuclearize themselves. So let's make architecture to force North Korea to make a choice between the dead end and the bright future. I think only when we create such an architecture with the big stakes and the big carrots, then the diplomacy can work.
Okay, we're going to have to take a break right now. More on the DPRK nuclear issue when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back to the show. We're talking about the recent imposition of new sanctions by the UN Security Council on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Let's get back to our panel. Yono, I want to start with you. The United States recently had a proposal to deploy a controversial missile shield in South Korea, the so-called THAAD system. Now, China is very concerned that the deployment of the system could intensify an arms race on the Korean peninsula. Could this in some way complicate the relationship between China and South Korea?
Yes, I think we are already witnessing the souring relationship between South Korea and China compared to the, improving, atmosphere, or a very friendly atmosphere, at least between the two leaders. President Park Geun-hye, she really tried hard to woo China to be on her side, and she even took a risk of annoying Washington, if you will, by attending a huge military parade in Beijing last year. And there was even a huge controversy over the possibility of South Korea tilting toward China at the expense of its relationship with the United States. And in that context, the initial responses from China to the fourth nuclear test at the beginning of this year was kind of disappointing from South Korea's point of view. And that was one of the reasons, I think, why the Park government decided to play this THAAD card, I think.
Amitav, of course, the situation has seemingly got to an impasse right now. We see a lot of problems, but does it also pose an opportunity for all the parties involved to resolve this issue? What do you see as the major opportunities here, and of course the pitfalls that lie ahead?
The main opportunity, of course, is the new spirit of a new understanding between the US and China. But let me just put some caveats to any sort of maybe excessive optimism on this. For one thing, it is possible to see why China is now coming out so strongly against the North Korean nuclear program is partly because of the pressure of the US deploying a missile shield in South Korea. China doesn't want that. So by being a little more flexible and coming to deal with this issue with cooperation, in cooperation with the U.S., may be a way to deflect or try to discourage the deployment of a U.S. missile shield in South Korea. Now, that's one possibility one cannot totally ignore. And the other thing is, just because, I mean, there is a bit of optimism that great powers can manage nuclear proliferation. We had the Iran nuclear deal, giving a bit of optimism. But the North Korea is a very different animal. And it's not Iran. It's desperate for regime survival. Regime survival is far more important for North Korea than it was for Iran. Iran is a country which has great power ambitions. Our ambitions should be at least a regional power, and it can make some concessions. So North Korea is going to fight to the bitter end, I would say. So let's not be too optimistic about how easily this can be resolved, despite the fact that we have a very positive development in the sense that China and US have a much more of a common ground.
Ambassador Hill, you mentioned earlier on those joint military exercises that were being carried out by the United States and by South Korea. Now, of course, we hear about this United States proposal to deploy a missile shield in South Korea. It's causing problems, a rupture slightly in the relationship with China. How does this complicate the situation? As you pointed out, those exercises have been long scheduled. They take place every spring.
Well, first of all, I think the U.S. ROK, Republic of Korea alliance, is an essential element for stability in the region. And I think everyone knows that, including China. So what is an alliance? An alliance is when you have an agreement that one side will come to the defense of the other. And so the way you do that is to make it credible. And so you have to have the troops working together, exercising together. And that's why there are these annual exercises. Otherwise, it's just an alliance on paper. It's not a real alliance. Secondly, with North Korea threatening and explicitly threatening other countries, most notably South Korea, with its medium to short-range missile technology, it seems that if that alliance is going to be real, the United States needs to work with the ROK on a defense against that kind of threat. Obviously, the Chinese don't like this. They fear that this could become a bigger deployment than just against North Korea, and it could somehow have an effect on China's own nuclear deterrence. But if you stop to think about it, it's very clear what has to be done if an alliance is to be credible in the eyes of the American people, and in this case, especially credible in the eyes of the South Korean people. So that's what is happening. And obviously, it's something that the U.S. and China need to have an understanding about, a clear understanding that this is not directed against China. But I think the problem here continues to be North Korea's unwillingness to deal with anyone and to address the central issue, which is their threatening posture toward other countries in the region with these nuclear weapons. And by the way, I do not accept the notion that these nuclear weapons are essential for their regime survival. If that regime does not survive, it will not be because of whether they have nuclear weapons or not. It will be because of the impoverishing of the North Korean people by this North Korean regime.
Yong-Shea, what is China's view on the deployment of that missile shield? Does it fear, as Ambassador Hill just pointed out, that this could be the beginning of a bigger deployment? And does China feel in some way that this could undermine its nuclear deterrent capability?
Well, first of all, I need to say, at least it's really wrong timing to discuss the deployment of the THAAD in South Korea between the ROK and the USA, because all of the three countries are now focusing on the cooperation on the very urgent issue of the nuclearization challenge by North Korea. And the deployment of a possibility of deployment of the THAAD really make a big hit on Chinese back. So the big strategic influence on THAAD is, you mentioned, that will make an imbalance, strategic imbalance here, and that will force China to make a rebalance by making reactions. So I'm afraid with the deployment of THAAD, not only the complicated relations between China and ROK, and also more complicated relation between China and the United States in this very sophisticated Northeast Asia because of the arms race in the anti-missile systems and missile attacking capabilities. The race, the competitions between the powers will be triggered.
Amitabh, there is a bit of a track record here insofar as how the United States handles nuclear proliferation. We saw that in the deal with Iran. You mentioned that a moment ago. There is a piece in Foreign Policy magazine which says that the United States needs to engage with the DPRK rather than just issue threats and impose sanctions. And the DPRK itself made that point in 2002 when Kim Jong-il wrote a letter to President George Bush at the time saying that it's prepared to negotiate in good faith if the United States recognized its sovereignty and if the United States assured it that there won't be aggressive moves made against it. Can that be used as a basis to get somewhere?
Well, the times have changed since that letter that you're talking about. And I think, of course, negotiation is always good. There's always a possibility that negotiation can lead to something, but we have to combine negotiation with certain amount of pressure. And at the current stage, for the past couple of years, North Korea has not given an indication of getting into serious negotiation. In the past, it did. And so that could have been, there could have been some missed opportunities. And again, I have different views on this from maybe officials of the U.S. government on this, who have worked in this field. But currently, I think the North Korean regime doesn't look like it's ready for negotiations unless there is some amount of pressure. And I think that therefore this development with the Chinese putting on more pressure is very, very positive. But I also would like to say that at least the Obama administration has always been very open about so-called negotiating with the enemy kind of posture. It has been part of its foreign policy philosophy, and that has worked in some places, and that hasn't worked in some places. I still think regime security is very important for North Korea, and I do think it has something to do with its obsession with the nuclear weapons, and maybe I have a difference of views on this with Ambassador Hill. But there are, of course, other things that could come into play. But I think I would always do both, as our Chinese friends say, carrots and sticks. Yeah. So you have some sticks and you increase the amount of pressure, but also you do offer some opening and some sort of a carrot as well. Some
kind of relief. Well, yeah. We shall see how it all unfolds. We're going to have to end it there, though. We've run out of time. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. We'd love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments, and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com. And we'd like to continue the conversation on social media. Give us your thoughts and comments on our Facebook page. That's at CCTV America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.